This is a Tomodachi, very inexpensive kitchen knife. You can buy a whole block of them for between $25 to $35 when they're on sale. Had sharpened a bunch of them for a friend lately, and I became curious about the performance of the steel while I was doing a bit of grinding, because the edge formed a relatively heavy burr that was kind of crumbly. That's not a good sign. And when I straightened out one of the tips, it cracked off, not a good sign, and it revealed a very coarse grain structure that I could see by eye, not a good sign. So then I was wondering, what would the edge retention be between this and this, which is a utility knife from Spyderco in MBS 26 at around 60 Rockwell. Relatively decent benchmark for performance in a lot of ways, not just edge retention, relatively comfortable handle, very nice high performance cutting blade shape, bunch of other issues. But you know, above average sort of performance, well below average. What kind of performance difference would you see in edge retention? Now, I use cardboard as the cutting media. You can't directly jump from, well, here's the ratio on cardboard, this is the ratio on foods. When the apex of a knife blunts, it does so by a combination of corrosion, fracture, wear, and deformation. And what percentages of each changes if you chop wood, or you slice cardboard, or you slice carpet, or you do push cutting on a potato. It's going to be relatively different. So you can't take the ratio and assume it's going to be the same. But with a little bit of common sense, slicing cardboard will give you a decent enough approximation to slicing sort of foods in the kitchen. The only thing is it sort of takes a lot longer because foods are generally not that abrasive. So, a first round of cutting that I did, sharpened the edges with a Suihiro Ryu 300 grit dual density, another fancy waterstone. Set the apex bevels at around 15 degrees per side with a medium extra fine DMT, one of the silliest names for sharpening stone ever, 6 micron stone. First round was rather poor. Not only did the apex chip on the Tomodachi, but the actual edge bevel itself chipped. Really, relatively large pieces came out of the edge. Now, this is where you might jump in and say, Cliff, this knife is $1. What did you expect? Well, better performance than that. Most people have rather skewed perspectives on a lot of these steels, because when they sharpen them and when they use them, they're always using them on fatigued metal. And the reason why is because people who buy inexpensive knives, and sometimes even people who buy expensive knives, use them rather harshly. So this does get abused. Now, a lot of times on the internet, especially on YouTube videos, people look at pretty much anything as abusive. You cut a bamboo chopstick with a survival knife? That's crazy. Okay, calm down. This was probably used, with an ice pick grip, jamming into pork chops, frying them apart, cutting directly on ceramic plates, scraping off stuff off a barbecue. That's what you sort of mean and sort of abusive for knives. So the apex and the edge of this just gets rammed by ceramics and steels, so it tends to get a bit fatigued. So that probably is one of the main reasons why it behaved so poorly the first round. So I did everything 3 times. Cut the apex off, resharpened it, did the whole thing, and did it again 3 times with each knife. And the second and third times the performance was much better. No big chipping, slight microfracture of the edge, which I would expect, but nothing significant. Just mainly stayed a little bit into the edge bevel. It was mainly into the apex bevel. The Spyderco utility, of course, just wore smooth. That's what you would expect. This is a very high apex stability steel relative to cutlery steels. MBS 26 is similar to 19C27. Sandvik actually describes it as a coarse steel, but again, they're comparing it to ABL, which is a razor blade steel. If you're comparing it to things like S30V, S90V, S110V, 10V, all the big VVV steels, it has relatively high apex stability. So it'll tend to basically wear to a very, very smooth apex. And of course, at around 60 Rockwell, this is significantly stronger than this, which is probably going to float somewhere between 50 to 55 Rockwell. I doubt quality control and consistency is very high with this. So, what kind of ratio did I end up with? Around 5 to 1. Which may surprise some people that it's not tremendously larger, because oftentimes you'll hear people state, sometimes they imply, sometimes they outright state it, that would lead you to believe that it's not just, multiples, it's like orders of magnitude. And some people even say that, no, with a decent knife, you can cut like a mile of cardboard, but with a cheap knife you can only do like a few feet and then the edge is gone. If your comparison is a mile to a couple of feet, it's like 1,000 to 1. You don't know how to sharpen a knife properly, because what you're seeing then is the results of sharpening, not the results of the steel. It might surprise people to know that the steel in this is probably not even twice as strong as the steel in this. And if you look at other properties like wear resistance and even toughness, they don't change by massively tremendous differences, even when you go to relatively big steels. Large differences in toughness in a lot of these cutlery steels can be something like 20 to 40%. Steel strengths generally are about the same, and wear resistance is roughly about the same. Now, if you go really different in steels, like you look at toughness of M2 versus S7, then you can get much bigger changes. But strength usually changes on a much smaller difference than that. So around 5 to 1. Now, would I expect it to be exactly the same ratio in the kitchen? No, because food is generally not abrasive, so it's mainly going to be deforming the edge versus abrading it. But I'd consider a sort of similar type comparison to result. So in the kitchen, if I had to sharpen this about once a month, you'd probably have to sharpen this about once a week. That's the reality where the performance actually goes. Interestingly enough, though, while I was using it for cutting up some of the cardboard, I was also doing some woodwork with it and some rope with it. I wanted to remove some of that fatigue metal along the edge. I wanted to sharpen it a bunch of times anyway, because one of the points I wanted to make to the owner when I returned it was, just look at the difference in performance between the paring knife, where I ground off some of the damaged metal, and the other knives where I didn't. Because sometimes the first time you sharpen a knife for somebody, if you haven't done it before, and you grind off, like say 1 millimeter or even 0.5 millimeter of steel to get rid of all that fatigued metal, it can sort of freak them out a little bit. And the other thing I say is, bring the knives back and have them sharpened at least about once a year, and then you won't get them in that horribly beat up state. It'll be more pleasant for you and more pleasant on the knives. You'll get more consistent performance out of them anyway if you do that. So anyway, I was doing some work with him, because I just wanted to get a feel for the knife, sort of appreciate the utility of it. And I was going to have to grind off that metal anyway to get back to relatively decent steel. The interesting thing is that, yes, while ease of sharpening isn't that great, it's a bit of a struggle to get this to really high sharpness. And you're probably not going to want to get this to the edge where it push cuts newsprint and, whittles here and shaves above the skin. At the edge, it'll be a bit finicky once you start to form an apex of that level, because again, it's a relatively coarse-grained steel and it's kind of soft. Those are not two great combinations, but you'll easily get to shave and slice newsprint and anything at all like that. But utility-wise, when I compare it to this is a K2 from Spyderco, collaboration with Farad Mir. There's no comparison. I would use the Tomodachi for utility work over this any day, twice on Sunday, as they'd say. Yes, this has a rather high-end super duper steel, CPM 10V, 60 plus Rockwell. Relatively decent blade grind on this. I don't like the upswept tip, but that's sort of a cultural, ethnic type thing. The ergonomics on this, though, are relatively poor. I mean, I've seen worse, but the cutout here in the lock bar, these are sharp corners left. The inside of the handle scales are barely chamfered at all. The end of the pocket clip is not fully rounded. So when you go to grip this to use it, I mean, this digs into my hand really sharply. These sharp edges right here are for the relief, if you allow you to hit the lock bar. Again, these are not rounded at all, so these are actually sharp points. So now, is the edge retention on that better than on this? Yeah. But practically, just ask yourself, when was the last time you sat down and you needed to do 1,000 continuous cuts on rope without having to sharpen it? That you need to cut a mile of cardboard without having to stop to sharpen it? Or you need to literally go out and make 100 slices through carpet and not be able to sharpen? So yeah, so 1,000 feet with this is probably similar to around 100 feet of cardboard with this. I can sharpen it in 1 to 2 passes on a diamond rod, and it's back to easily shaving and, slicing newsprint effortlessly. This is much more comfortable, very secure in hand, and I can work with it for hours with no issues, no hot spots, whatever. And yeah, stop to take a break every 10 minutes, make a couple of passes, and it's shaving again. I can't work with this for very long at all, and it starts to hotspot. That's one of the big complaints I've had with Spyderco knives recently. Yeah, they're doing a great job. We're bringing in lots of new steels, doing collaboration with makers, and Spyderco does a lot of great things. But ergonomics I've really found to be lacking lately, and it seems to me that they're moving sort of away from a performance-based perspective, because a lot of these things you'd pick up immediately. Anyone who takes this knife out and uses it for just 5 to 10 minutes will start to notice these things. And they're not just specific to my hand. No one's hand is comfortable hitting sharp corners. So that kind of deal. Some size things can be rather specific to your hand, but this handle is fully rounded everywhere. There's no sharp edges, and it's like a dollar. So take that from what you will. So interesting kind of little experiment, looking at sort of a low worst case performance in a kitchen knife that's between $1 to $2, and a relatively decent, solid performing kitchen knife. Is this the best utility kitchen knife you can get? No, and I doubt Spyderco would argue. But it sets a relatively decent performance standard, not only for steel, but also for many other aspects. Very, very comfortable handle. Again, slightly contoured in all dimensions. Has a little drop blade there with a little bit of a guard to prevent slip-ups on it. The front of the handle is nicely rounded, so you can work on top of it for pinch grips. Has a relatively narrow blade for this length of blade, which means it's decent enough for paring, but also wide enough for some slicing to stop the blade from twisting. It's very, very narrow blades, can twist relatively easily. So this is a very multi-purpose knife in the kitchen. If I didn't know what I was going to be doing and just had to grab a knife to do some kitchen work, this is a solid choice, because it does very well over a large amount of work and doesn't do horribly in pretty much anything. Whether if you take a paring knife, it's very easy to get it where it doesn't perform very well, and if you take a chef's knife, it's easy to look at stuff where it doesn't perform very well. That's one of the nice things about utility knives. They work very well over a tremendous amount of application. So anyway, there's just a little comparison with edge retention on Tomodachi versus a Spyderco.